He came back from war with nothing left but silence, and a retired K-9 who never stopped listening. When a single letter pulled them into the mountains during the hottest summer in decades, he expected paperwork, maybe disappointment. What he found instead was a hidden structure buried in stone, a place that stayed cool while the land outside cracked under heat and fire. As heavy machines closed in and the mountain began to shift, his dog sensed danger long before any human instrument could. And in the narrow space between loss and collapse, one man had to decide whether to walk away or stay and protect something meant to save lives. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Bozeman, Montana in midsummer doesn't look harsh at first glance. The sky is a clean, hard blue that feels scrubbed into place, and the light comes down like a weight, bright enough to bleach fence boards and turn the gravel along back roads into a pale shimmer. By noon, heat gathers in the open fields, and even the pines up on the foothills seem to hold their breath. In town, the air smells of cut hay, sunscreen, and warm asphalt. Outside the last strip malls, it shifts to resin, dust, and sun-baked earth. It's the kind of summer that makes people talk about dry season the way they talk about a long illness, casual, practiced, and quietly wary. Graham Sutter lived on the edge of that brightness in a rented one-bedroom set back from the highway where the pavement thinned into packed dirt. The place was plain and a little tired, sun-faded siding, a porch that dipped in the middle, a screen door that stuck if you didn't lift it just right. Graham liked it that way. He'd come home from the army without the clean ceremony people imagine, no applause, no dramatic farewell, just signatures and a stamp in a fluorescent office that smelled faintly of copier toner. After that, he learned to prefer things that didn't demand a story. He was 38, lean but solid, the kind of build earned by years of carrying weight without complaint. His hair was dark, cut short out of habit rather than vanity, and the sun had drawn a persistent line across the bridge of his nose. A trimmed shadow of stubble clung to his jaw most days, not rugged so much as unbothered. His eyes were a steady hazel, but the way he used them, quick checks, small reassessments, made people think of green lights on a dashboard. You didn't see much emotion in his face unless you paid attention to his hands, how they tightened around a coffee mug, how they paused an extra second over a latch. The only thing in his life that moved with uncomplicated confidence was Valor. Valor was a retired working-line German shepherd, 7 years old, tall at the shoulder with a thick sable coat that faded from black along his back to warmer tan on his legs and chest. His muzzle had begun to silver near the whiskers, and a thin scar ran through the fur above one eye, an old souvenir from training or work that neither dog nor handler ever found worth explaining. When he stood, he looked like a creature carved for purpose, straight-backed, alert ears, amber eyes that held steady on whatever mattered. When he rested, he did it completely, folding his long body into the doorway like a living threshold. Valor didn't seek affection the way pet dogs did. He chose proximity. He leaned a shoulder into Graham's shin while Graham fixed a hinge. He placed himself between the house and the dark as if the dark had once earned a file in his mind. Most mornings in Bozeman began the same for Graham. Wake before the sun fully cleared the hills, coffee strong and black, Valor's bowl filled, the water replaced even if it looked untouched, a walk around the yard, not for exercise but for perimeter and pattern. Routine wasn't hope, but it was structure, and structure was what grief couldn't take from him. Grief had arrived in a single phone call the year before. His wife, Lila, was gone. An accident, a sentence delivered with the careful gentleness of professionals trained to soften the edges of disaster. The details never sat comfortably in his mind. He remembered the words, not the reasons. Sudden, unavoidable. We're sorry. Lila had been 36, and she'd carried herself like someone who didn't want pity but accepted tenderness when it was earned. She was tall and narrow-hipped, with a long neck and a habit of tucking loose strands of hair behind her ear when she concentrated. Her hair was dark auburn, almost brown until sunlight hit it and brought out copper, and she wore it in a messy knot that always looked like it was one breath away from falling apart. Her skin was pale and freckled quickly in summer, especially across her forearms, and she had wide-set brown eyes that held a quiet, stubborn curiosity. Lila wasn't loud in crowds. She watched people first, then spoke as if she'd already measured the effect of her words. At home, though, she laughed with her whole chest, unguarded, the kind of laugh that made Graham feel like the world might not always be a place that demanded readiness. After she died, Graham didn't throw himself into destructive habits or public sorrow. He did what he'd always done when he didn't know what else to do. He organized, he packed their apartment into labeled boxes, he donated what he couldn't bear to keep. He drove north because the thought of staying in a place full of echoes made his lungs feel too tight. Bozeman became a compromise between disappearing and living. There were jobs, fence repairs, shed roofs, patching storm-damaged siding. People here didn't ask too many questions as long as you showed up and did the work cleanly. On the afternoon the letter arrived, the heat was the kind that made even shade feel thin. Graham came back from a small job on the edge of town with sweat dried into pale salt at his temples. Valor trotted beside him, tongue just visible, not panting hard but attentive. The mailbox sat at the end of the short drive, a metal rectangle bleached almost white by the sun. Graham flipped it open and found the usual clutter: a grocery flyer, a power bill, a postcard advertising river rafting. And beneath them, a thick envelope that looked out of place in the casual stack, heavy paper, official seal, the kind of thing that implied forms and consequences. The return address read, State Heritage Records Office. Graham's first instinct was to set it on the counter and forget it until he had the energy for bureaucracy. He turned toward the porch. Valor moved first. The dog stepped in front of the screen door and stood still, blocking the entrance with calm certainty. His ears angled forward, his gaze fixed on the envelope in Graham's hand, as if it were a scent he recognized, a sound he'd been waiting to hear. When Graham shifted his weight, trying to sidestep, Valor adjusted without aggression, just presence. A quiet no. That's new, Graham muttered, more to himself than the dog. He looked down at Valor's face. The dog's eyes didn't plead, they measured. It was the same look Valor used when a car backfired in the distance, or when a stranger lingered too long by the yard. Attention without panic, decision without drama. Graham sighed, turned, and walked back to the mailbox post where the sunlight fell clear. He tore open the envelope with a thumb, the paper resisting at first, then giving in with a clean rip. The letter inside was printed, precise and indifferent. It informed him that Lila Sutter had been listed as a secondary heir to a property recently cleared through probate review. The property was described as an earth-sheltered wooden structure located in a mountainous zone near Butte, Montana, unoccupied for decades, currently misclassified under outdated zoning and scheduled for reassessment due to pending land use activity. No photograph, no valuation, only coordinates and a phone number for inquiries. Graham read it once, twice. On the third pass, he felt irritation rise, not anger, not even disbelief, but the kind of tight frustration that came from learning. There was more paperwork attached to a life he was trying to keep quiet. A structure, not a bank account, not a family cabin mentioned in holiday stories. Lila had never spoken about owning a place. She hadn't mentioned a trust, an aunt, a mountain property. If she had held a secret like that, it wasn't because she was careless. It was because she had chosen silence. He folded the letter sharply and stared at the line of coordinates as if they might rearrange themselves into something reasonable. Heat shimmered off the road. A meadowlark called somewhere far off. The world went on being summer. Valor didn't relax. Instead, the dog stepped closer and pressed his nose lightly against the folded paper, breathing in slow and deliberate as if scent could explain what language refused to. His tail stayed low and still. His ears remained forward, tuned to something beyond the mailbox and the yard and the obvious. Graham's throat tightened in a place he didn't like to acknowledge. He swallowed, the motion dry. He looked past the trees toward the foothills, where the line of pines met the sky like a boundary. He told himself it was coincidence, a clerical leftover from someone else's life, but Lila's name on that letter didn't feel like an accident. It felt like a door. Inside, the house was warm, and the air from the swamp cooler rattled weakly through the vent. Graham set the letter on the kitchen table and reached for a glass of water. Valor followed, nails clicking softly on the worn linoleum. Graham drank, set the glass down, and stared at the envelope as if staring long enough might turn it into nothing. When he turned away to rinse the cup, Valor's paw nudged the paper, gentle but persistent. The envelope slid a few inches closer to Graham's side of the table, an unmistakable insistence dressed up as a simple movement. Graham froze, not because he was afraid, but because something inside him recognized the pattern. Alert, insist, repeat. The kind of behavior that had kept him alive when he'd rather not admit how close things had been. He sat down slowly. The chair creaked. He unfolded the letter again and read the coordinates with a different kind of attention. Somewhere in his mind, a map began to form, not as escape, not as adventure, but as a question, with edges sharp enough to cut. Valor lowered himself at Graham's feet, chin resting on his paws. Eyes open. Outside, Bozeman's summer kept blazing. Blue sky, dry grass, the quiet thread of wildfire season hanging in the distance like a memory of smoke. Graham looked at the letter one more time, then at the dog. He didn't promise anything out loud. He didn't have to. Valor had already chosen to pay attention, and Graham, against his own habit of turning away from what complicated him, felt the first small shift of a decision beginning to take shape. The next morning arrived already tired. Heat pressed low over Bozeman, the kind that made even early light feel heavy, as if the sun had skipped the courtesy of warming up slowly. Graham Sutter woke before the alarm out of habit, the room dim and warm, the faint whir of the swamp cooler doing little more than move hot air from one corner to another. Valor was already awake, lying parallel to the door, head up, ears relaxed but attentive. He didn't rise when Graham swung his legs off the bed. He watched. Graham brewed coffee and stood at the counter, shirtless, the cool ceramic of the mug grounding him. His reflection in the window looked slightly older than he felt. Lines at the corners of his eyes etched deeper by squinting into sun and distance, shoulders marked by the quiet stiffness that never fully left after long years of wearing weight. He thought of the letter on the table without looking at it, like a presence in the room that hadn't spoken yet. By 8, the temperature was already climbing. Graham loaded his tools into the truck for a fencing job west of town, a small ranch that paid cash and asked no questions. Valor jumped into the passenger seat without being told, settling with his body angled forward, nose near the cracked window. As they drove, Graham noticed the dog's focus sharpen, not on passing cars or pedestrians, but on the land itself. When the road curved toward a low, brushy area where a seasonal creek had once run, Valor stiffened. His ears rose. His body leaned subtly away from the shoulder. Graham slowed, frowning. The spot looked unremarkable. Dry grass, scattered stones, nothing that suggested danger. He drove on, but the sensation stayed with him. Valor didn't relax until they reached the open fields again. The ranch belonged to a man named Pete Hollander, a broad-shouldered local in his late 50s, with a sun-cracked face and a gray beard cut unevenly, as if trimmed by convenience rather than mirror. Pete had grown up here, left for a few years after a bad fire took his family's first house, then come back and rebuilt with stubborn patience. He greeted Graham with a nod, eyes flicking to Valor with an approving glance. "Good dog," he said simply, the way men did when they meant respect more than praise. They worked under the sun, stretching wire and resetting posts. Pete talked while they worked, not probing questions, just commentary on weather patterns, water rights, the way summers felt longer now than they used to. Graham answered when necessary, conserving words. Valor stayed close, moving with them, occasionally lifting his head to scan the tree line before settling again. When they finished, Pete handed Graham an envelope and offered cold water from a dented cooler. Graham drank deeply, the chill biting his throat. "You ever been up near Butte?" Pete asked casually. Graham paused. "Once or twice?" Pete nodded, squinting at the horizon. "Strange land up there. Looks solid till it isn't. Had a cousin lost a horse once. Ground just gave under her. Summer, too. Folks think winter's the only danger." Graham felt the words settle with an uncomfortable precision. He thanked Pete, loaded the truck, and drove back toward town with the letter pressing against his thoughts again. By late afternoon, the heat was relentless. Graham stopped at the public library, a low brick building with wide windows shaded by cottonwoods. Inside, the air conditioning hummed softly. Valor stayed in the truck, windows down, water set, a routine they both trusted. Graham stepped inside and was met with the smell of paper and old carpet, a welcome contrast to dust and sun. Behind the main desk stood Juniper Hart, June, as she introduced herself when Graham approached. She was in her early 30s, slim, with dark hair cut to her jaw and glasses that slid down her nose when she leaned forward. Her posture was alert but relaxed, like someone who spent her days moving between quiet tasks and sudden demands. When she smiled, it wasn't automatic. It came after consideration. "How can I help you?" she asked. Graham hesitated, then placed the letter on the counter. "I'm looking for information on a property. Older records." June scanned the letter quickly, her expression shifting from neutral to curious. "State heritage," she murmured. "That narrows things down." She glanced up at him, studying his face, not intrusively, but with professional assessment. "Do you know what kind of structure it is?" "No," Graham said. "That's the problem." June nodded once. "All right, let's start with maps." They moved to a back room lined with drawers and shelves, the air cooler here, quieter. June pulled out oversized folders and rolled them onto a long table. As she worked, Graham noticed the efficiency of her movements, decisive, practiced. She didn't waste steps. "These older classifications," she said, tracing a finger along a faded line, "they don't always match modern zoning, especially for experimental builds. Post-war era saw a lot of creative solutions." "Creative," Graham echoed. She glanced at him. "That's the polite word." A faint smile flickered. "Your wife, Lila, she requested some of these records a few years ago." Graham's chest tightened. "You remember her?" June nodded. She stood out, not loud but intent. She asked good questions, the kind that make you pull a book you didn't think anyone would want. She hesitated. She was looking into passive structures, earth-sheltered designs, things that survive heat and fire. Graham closed his eyes briefly. Lila, leaning over a table like this, hair falling loose, eyes bright with that quiet fire. He swallowed. "Did she say why?" June shook her head. She didn't need to. Sometimes people are just preparing. They spent an hour going through records. The structure near Butte appeared only as a footnote, a test site, uninhabited, never fully decommissioned. June printed what she could and slid the papers across the table. "If you go," she said carefully, "be cautious. Summer ground can lie." Outside, the sky had begun to haze, the sun dulled by distant smoke. Graham returned to the truck and found Valor awake, watching the horizon. As they drove home, the smell of heat deepened and the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint, acrid edge. That night, Graham spread the papers on the kitchen table. Valor lay at his feet, head up. Graham traced the lines on the map, the coordinates no longer abstract. He imagined the land as Pete had described it, solid until it wasn't. He imagined Lila standing somewhere on that slope, deciding not to speak yet. When he hovered over his laptop, a blank email open, an inquiry to the number on the letter, Valor rose and placed his paw lightly against Graham's knee. Not a command, a reminder. "All right," Graham said quietly. "We'll look." Outside, Bozeman's summer night settled in, warm and restless. Somewhere beyond the town lights, the land waited, unchanged by hesitation. Graham shut the laptop and began to pack, not for escape, but for inspection. Tools, water, rope, and space on the passenger seat where Valor already sat, steady and certain, as if the route ahead had always been part of the map. The next morning arrived already tired. Heat pressed low over Bozeman, the kind that made even early light feel heavy, as if the sun had skipped the courtesy of warming up slowly. Graham Sutter woke before the alarm out of habit, the room dim and warm, the faint whir of the swamp cooler doing little more than move hot air from one corner to another. Valor was already awake, lying parallel to the door, head up, ears relaxed but attentive. He didn't rise when Graham swung his legs off the bed. He watched. Graham brewed coffee and stood at the counter, shirtless, the cool ceramic of the mug grounding him. His reflection in the window looked slightly older than he felt. lines at the corners of his eyes etched deeper by squinting into sun and distance, shoulders marked by the quiet stiffness that never fully left after long years of wearing weight. He thought of the letter on the table without looking at it, like a presence in the room that hadn't spoken yet. By 8, the temperature was already climbing. Graham loaded his tools into the truck for a fencing job west of town, a small ranch that paid cash and asked no questions. Valor jumped into the passenger seat without being told, settling with his body angled forward, nose near the cracked window. As they drove, Graham noticed the dog's focus sharpen, not on passing cars or pedestrians, but on the land itself. When the road curved toward a low, brushy area where a seasonal creek had once run, Valor stiffened. His ears rose. His body leaned subtly away from the shoulder. Graham slowed, frowning. The spot looked unremarkable. Dry grass, scattered stones, nothing that suggested danger. He drove on, but the sensation stayed with him. Valor didn't relax until they reached the open fields again. The ranch belonged to a man named Pete Hollander, a broad-shouldered local in his late 50s, with a sun-cracked face and a gray beard cut unevenly, as if trimmed by convenience rather than mirror. Pete had grown up here, left for a few years after a bad fire took his family's first house, then come back and rebuilt with stubborn patience. He greeted Graham with a nod, eyes flicking to Valor with an approving glance. "Good dog," he said simply, the way men did when they meant respect more than praise. They worked under the sun, stretching wire and resetting posts. Pete talked while they worked, not probing questions, just commentary on weather patterns, water rights, the way summers felt longer now than they used to. Graham answered when necessary, conserving words. Valor stayed close, moving with them, occasionally lifting his head to scan the tree line before settling again. When they finished, Pete handed Graham an envelope and offered cold water from a dented cooler. Graham drank deeply, the chill biting his throat. "You ever been up near Butte?" Pete asked casually. Graham paused. "Once or twice?" Pete nodded, squinting at the horizon. "Strange land up there. Looks solid till it isn't. Had a cousin lost a horse once. Ground just gave under her. Summer, too. Folks think winter's the only danger." Graham felt the words settle with an uncomfortable precision. He thanked Pete, loaded the truck, and drove back toward town with the letter pressing against his thoughts again. By late afternoon, the heat was relentless. Graham stopped at the public library, a low brick building with wide windows shaded by cottonwoods. Inside, the air conditioning hummed softly. Valor stayed in the truck, windows down, water set, a routine they both trusted. Graham stepped inside and was met with the smell of paper and old carpet, a welcome contrast to dust and sun. Behind the main desk stood Juniper Hart, June, as she introduced herself when Graham approached. She was in her early 30s, slim, with dark hair cut to her jaw and glasses that slid down her nose when she leaned forward. Her posture was alert but relaxed, like someone who spent her days moving between quiet tasks and sudden demands. When she smiled, it wasn't automatic. It came after consideration. "How can I help you?" she asked. Graham hesitated, then placed the letter on the counter. "I'm looking for information on a property. Older records." June scanned the letter quickly, her expression shifting from neutral to curious. "State heritage," she murmured. "That narrows things down." She glanced up at him, studying his face, not intrusively, but with professional assessment. "Do you know what kind of structure it is?" "No," Graham said. "That's the problem." June nodded once. "All right, let's start with maps." They moved to a back room lined with drawers and shelves, the air cooler here, quieter. June pulled out oversized folders and rolled them onto a long table. As she worked, Graham noticed the efficiency of her movements, decisive, practiced. She didn't waste steps. "These older classifications," she said, tracing a finger along a faded line, "they don't always match modern zoning, especially for experimental builds. Post-war era saw a lot of creative solutions." "Creative," Graham echoed. She glanced at him. "That's the polite word." A faint smile flickered. "Your wife, Lila, she requested some of these records a few years ago." Graham's chest tightened. "You remember her?" June nodded. She stood out, not loud but intent. She asked good questions, the kind that make you pull a book you didn't think anyone would want. She hesitated. She was looking into passive structures, earth-sheltered designs, things that survive heat and fire. Graham closed his eyes briefly. Lila, leaning over a table like this, hair falling loose, eyes bright with that quiet fire. He swallowed. Did she say why? June shook her head. She didn't need to. Sometimes people are just preparing. They spent an hour going through records. The structure near Butte appeared only as a footnote, a test site, uninhabited, never fully decommissioned. June printed what she could and slid the papers across the table. If you go, she said carefully, be cautious. Summer ground can lie. Outside, the sky had begun to haze, the sun dulled by distant smoke. Graham returned to the truck and found Valor awake, watching the horizon. As they drove home, the smell of heat deepened and the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint, acrid edge. That night, Graham spread the papers on the kitchen table. Valor lay at his feet, head up. Graham traced the lines on the map, the coordinates no longer abstract. He imagined the land as Pete had described it, solid until it wasn't. He imagined Lila standing somewhere on that slope, deciding not to speak yet. When he hovered over his laptop, a blank email open, an inquiry to the number on the letter, Valor rose and placed his paw lightly against Graham's knee. Not a command, a reminder. All right, Graham said quietly. We'll look. Outside, Bozeman's summer night settled in, warm and restless. Somewhere beyond the town lights, the land waited, unchanged by hesitation. Graham shut the laptop and began to pack, not for escape, but for inspection. Tools, water, rope, and space on the passenger seat where Valor already sat, steady and certain, as if the route ahead had always been part of the map. The drive toward Butte began before sunrise. Not out of urgency, but because Graham Sutter had learned that roads told the truth best when they weren't crowded with intention. Dawn laid a thin, pale band along the horizon, and the sky above it remained bruised purple, as if night were reluctant to release its claim. Summer heat had not yet gathered its full weight, but the air was already dry enough to taste. Dust lingered in the low places, unmoving, as if waiting for a signal to rise. Graham loaded the truck with deliberate economy. 2 gallons of water, a coil of rope, a compact toolkit with more steel than plastic, a flashlight, spare batteries, a first aid kit he hadn't used in years but still checked out of respect. He paused, then added a folded tarp. Valor watched from the passenger seat, posture steady. Ears loose but angled forward. At 7 years old, the dog carried himself with the calm authority of experience, his movements efficient, his gaze unromantic. When Graham closed the tailgate, Valor shifted slightly, aligning his body with the direction of the road ahead, as if the map had already printed itself behind his eyes. They left Bozeman while the town still slept. The outskirts thinned into pasture, then into scrub, then into long stretches of nothing that made the horizon feel farther away than it was. As the sun rose, heat began to assemble in layers. Graham drove with the window cracked, letting the wind pull sweat from his skin. He didn't turn on the radio. Silence wasn't emptiness to him, it was information. At a small service station near the edge of nowhere, Graham stopped for fuel. The building was low and square, its white paint peeling in sun-curled strips. Inside, the air smelled of oil, coffee, and scorched dust. A man stood behind the counter, mid-40s, wiry, with a sharp nose and a trimmed beard that framed a mouth accustomed to skepticism. His name tag read, Calvin, the letters scratched and faded. Morning, Calvin said, eyes flicking to Graham's truck and then to Valor waiting patiently inside. You're heading up early, Graham nodded. Trying to beat the heat? Calvin snorted softly. Good luck with that. He rang up the fuel without small talk, then paused, gaze narrowing slightly. You going toward the ridge past Butte? Graham felt the question land with more weight than it should have. Why? Calvin shrugged, but it wasn't careless. Survey trucks been coming through. Not tourists. They don't look around. They measure. Graham filed the word away. Measure. Thanks, he said, and left before curiosity could become conversation. Back on the road, the land rose and folded, the vegetation shifting from open grass to denser stands of pine. Heat shimmered across the asphalt, and the sky sharpened into a hard, cloudless blue. As the road narrowed and then gave way to gravel, Valor's posture changed. His ears lifted, his tail went still. When the truck rolled over a shallow dip where the earth darkened, the dog's muscles tensed, a subtle warning Graham felt rather than saw. "Easy," Graham murmured, easing off the accelerator. The gravel road wound upward, cutting across the slope in a way that felt provisional, like something the land tolerated rather than welcomed. He followed the printed directions, counting turns, trusting the coordinates more than the path itself. The structure did not announce its presence. There was no clearing, no dramatic reveal. It appeared gradually, as if the hillside had learned to hold a secret and only now permitted a hint of geometry. At first, Graham saw only an irregular shadow where sunlight should have pooled, then a line, too straight to be natural, where grass gave way to packed earth and stone. A roof, but not as roofs were usually understood. It was a continuation of the hill, layered with soil and scrub, grass growing undisturbed across its back. Graham parked at a respectful distance and shut off the engine. Silence pressed in, complete and heavy. Even insects seemed to pause. He stepped out, boots crunching softly, and stood still long enough to feel his own breathing settle. The heat here was different. Less oppressive. The air carried a faint coolness that didn't match the sun. Valor exited the truck slowly, nose low, tail neutral. He began a careful circuit, moving in an arc rather than a straight line, pausing at certain points to sniff deeply. His body language was focused but not alarmed, like a professional evaluating conditions rather than reacting to them. When he reached the front of the structure, a thick wooden door set into the slope, reinforced with iron hardware. He stopped and sat. Graham frowned. Valor rarely sat unprompted. "You're sure?" Graham said quietly, not asking, just acknowledging. He approached the door. The wood was weathered but intact, the grain raised in places by decades of sun and wind. The handle was cool under his palm, unexpectedly so. When he pulled, the door opened with a low, patient creak. The air inside was steady, not cold, not damp, just cool enough to register against skin heated by the sun. The smell was clean, earth and old wood, no rot, no mildew. Stone flooring met Graham's boots with solid reassurance. As his eyes adjusted, he saw structure where he had expected neglect. Walls of timber and packed clay, smooth in places where hands had shaped them long ago. Narrow corridors angled upward and inward, connecting levels that stepped back into the hillside rather than stacking above it. Valor crossed the threshold, then stopped. His shoulders tightened, his ears lifted sharply. He took one step toward a downward passage, then halted completely, feet planted, body refusing the invitation. Graham watched, pulse steady but attentive. He had seen this stance before, when a space failed a test that instruments couldn't perform. "All right," Graham said, backing away. He moved instead toward a middle level, following the natural rise of the structure. Here, the air felt even more balanced. Valor followed, posture easing. When they reached a spot along the inner wall, the dog lay down and exhaled, long and slow, as if choosing it. They spent the next hour exploring what was accessible without forcing anything. Some sections were cluttered with debris, collapsed shelving, rusted tools arranged with a care that suggested order rather than abandonment. Others were unexpectedly clear, purposeful. Graham traced a finger along a wall, feeling the subtle difference in texture where clay met timber. He noticed narrow slits positioned with intention, catching light without surrendering heat. By late afternoon, sunlight angled through the openings, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily, unconcerned with the outside world. Graham sat on the stone floor, back against the wall, and drank water. Valor remained nearby, alert but calm. Outside, the heat pressed down, relentless. Inside, time loosened its grip. Graham tested the threshold once more, stepping briefly toward the lower passage. The air grew heavier there, the stone underfoot cooler, denser. He felt a faint vibration, not movement, not sound, but pressure that registered somewhere beneath thought. He stepped back. Valor did not follow him downward. He didn't need to. The message was clear. As evening approached, Graham faced a practical decision. The road back was long, and the light was already thinning. The weather, though clear, had that brittle quality that preceded sudden change. He told himself staying was a calculation, not a choice. Darkness fell quickly here, the hillside swallowing the last of the sun without ceremony. They slept on the middle level. Graham spread the tarp and blankets on the stone, noticing with a flicker of unease that his breath did not fog, even as he heard the night cool outside. Valor settled beside him, body relaxed, ears occasionally twitching at sounds filtered through earth and wood. Wind moved through the pines above, its voice softened, distant. Graham lay awake longer than he liked, staring into the dim. He thought of Lila, not as memory, but as intention, of the way she had chosen silence not as concealment, but as patience. The structure around him did not feel empty. It felt complete, as if it had been waiting without expectation. By morning, frost silvered the ground outside the door, a sharp contrast to the stable air within. Graham stepped out, breath puffing white, then back inside where warmth followed him like a held breath. He stood there, hand against the wall, and felt the truth settle without drama. This was not a ruin. It was a system. And systems, once understood, did not let go easily. Morning inside the structure arrived without announcement. There was no sharp edge of dawn, no sudden invasion of light. Instead, illumination seeped in slowly through the narrow openings cut into the hillside, thin bands of pale gold sliding across the packed clay walls, as if the mountain itself were deciding how much of the day to allow inside. Graham Sutter woke before Valor moved, his body attuned to subtle changes after years of sleeping lightly. For a moment, he stayed still, listening. The house did not creak. It did not sigh or settle the way old cabins did when temperatures shifted. The air remained steady, cool but not cold, as if held in careful balance. Graham exhaled and watched his breath out of habit. Nothing clouded. Outside, he could hear the faint crackle of frost melting, the soft drip of water beginning its slow descent down the slope. Valor stirred, lifting his head and stretching his long forelegs before rising to a sit. In the low morning light, the dog's sable coat caught subtle highlights, black along the spine, warm brown along the ribs, silver beginning to show at the edges of his muzzle. His amber eyes were clear and alert, but his posture lacked urgency. Whatever vigilance had marked the night had softened into assessment. "You slept," Graham murmured, more observation than comment. Valor's tail gave a single, restrained thump against the stone floor. Graham stood and stepped outside. Cold met him immediately, sharp enough to bite the skin of his arms. The hillside was rimed with frost, white crust clinging to grass and stone alike, despite the promise of another brutal summer day. He scanned the slope below and felt a familiar tightening between his shoulders, not fear, but calculation. Tracks marked the dirt road faintly. Tire treads, recent. He crouched to examine them. Heavy vehicles, not recreational. The pattern suggested slow movement, repeated passes. Someone had been working nearby while he slept, separated from him by nothing more than elevation and intent. When he returned inside, the temperature wrapped around him again, indifferent to the morning's chill. The contrast made something click into place. This wasn't just shelter from weather, it was insulation from volatility, from the violent swings that defined the surface world. Graham spent the next hours moving deliberately through the structure, not exploring so much as verifying. He traced airflow with a scrap of cloth held near the narrow slits, watching how it drew inward rather than pushed out. He noted the angled corridors, the way ceilings stepped down and back, forcing warm air to rise gradually and redistribute instead of pooling. The design was old, but not primitive. Someone had thought about failure points. Someone had planned for extremes. Valor followed him at a measured distance, stopping where Graham stopped, sitting when Graham paused to think. When Graham drifted toward the lower passage again, Valor's posture changed instantly. His ears lifted, his shoulders tightened. He did not block Graham's path this time. He simply refused to accompany him, standing firm at the boundary between levels. "All right," Graham said quietly. "I hear you." He turned back toward the upper tier, and the tension in Valor's body eased. By midday, heat returned with familiar cruelty. Outside, the frost vanished, replaced by the dry shimmer of summer asserting itself. Graham packed his gear and locked the door behind them, not because he feared intrusion, but because the act felt correct, a gesture of respect rather than ownership. As they descended the mountain road, the structure folded back into the hillside, its outline dissolving until it became nothing more than shadow and suggestion. Bozeman felt louder when they returned. Graham noticed it immediately, the rush of traffic, the sharp angles of buildings, the way heat bounced off metal and glass without restraint. He stopped at the same service station where he'd fueled the day before. Calvin was there again, wiping down the counter with mechanical precision. "You look like you went somewhere that didn't want you to talk about it," Calvin said, not unkindly. Graham considered the comment. "Something like that." Calvin's eyes flicked to Valor, then back to Graham. "Survey truck's been moving heavier today. Folks say Redstone's pushing to get their permits fast-tracked." "Redstone?" Graham asked. "Materials outfit," Calvin replied. "Mining, access roads, staging areas. They don't like delays." He shrugged. "Land doesn't get a vote." Graham left without responding, but the words stayed with him. That afternoon, he drove to the outskirts of town where a Forest Service truck sat angled along a dirt pull-off. A man stood beside it, clipboard tucked under one arm. He was tall but stooped slightly, as if years of walking uneven ground had taught his spine a cautious curve. His beard was gray and kept short, practical rather than styled. His jacket bore the faded insignia of the Forest Service, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. "Graham Sutter," the man said before Graham could speak. "Cole Maddox." Graham paused. "We met?" Cole shook his head. "No, but I've seen your truck go by, and I know your dog." His gaze dropped to Valor, who stood quietly at Graham's side, body neutral, eyes watchful. "He pays attention." Cole's voice carried the gravel of someone who had spent decades outdoors, but his eyes were sharp, measuring. He gestured toward the ridgeline. "That structure up there. It's older than most of the paperwork attached to it, built during a time when folks thought they could outthink weather instead of fighting it." "You know what it is," Graham said. "I know what it isn't," Cole replied. "It isn't abandoned, and it isn't safe to ignore." They walked a short distance away from the road, where the smell of pine resin thickened the air. Cole spoke carefully, choosing words like tools. The mountain had pockets of unstable ground, he explained, areas where pressure built quietly over time. Drill into the wrong place, and the slope wouldn't just slide, it would collapse inward. "And Redstone?" Graham asked. Cole's mouth tightened. "They see resources, copper, maybe something deeper. They don't see systems, and they don't listen." Valor shifted, ears lifting as a distant mechanical hum reached them, faint but unmistakable. Cole noticed the dog's reaction and nodded once. "That's your early warning system." That night, Graham sat at his kitchen table, maps and notes spread before him. Valor lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes open. Graham replayed the day in his mind. The tracks, the steady air inside the structure, Cole's words. Lila's silence felt less like absence now and more like instruction. He opened his laptop and began to write, not to the number on the letter, not yet, but to himself. Observations, questions, points of concern, systems he understood and systems he didn't. The act of documenting steadied him, gave shape to the growing sense that walking away would not end this cleanly. When he finally closed the laptop, the house around him felt too thin, too exposed. Valor rose and placed his head against Graham's knee, weight solid and present. "I know," Graham said softly. Outside, the summer night pressed in, restless and hot. Somewhere up on the mountain, a structure older than most of the town waited, indifferent to permits and profit. Graham looked at the maps one last time and made a decision he didn't name yet, only felt. He would go back, not to claim, not to hide, but to understand what the mountain remembered and what it might demand next. The following day broke under a sky bleached almost white, the kind of summer morning that promised no mercy by noon. Graham Sutter arrived at the mountain before the heat fully settled, parking the truck well below the flagged area Redstone had abandoned the night before. The air was already sharp with dust and resin. Valor leapt down and stood still, reading the slope the way other dogs read faces. His ears lifted, then eased. Whatever danger had pressed so hard the previous afternoon had loosened its grip. for now. Graham climbed carefully, avoiding disturbed soil, keeping his weight light and deliberate. He did not hurry. Systems punished haste. At the door, he paused, resting his palm against the wood, feeling the familiar coolness seep into his skin. The structure received him without resistance. Inside, the air felt subtly different than the night before, not warmer, not cooler, but attentive, as if the balance had shifted by degrees too small for instruments, but large enough for a body trained to notice. Graham set down his pack and knelt, pressing his ear briefly to the packed clay wall. Nothing, no vibration, no low hum. Whatever stress had surged during the survey incident had redistributed and settled. Valor moved ahead, padding toward the upper tier with confidence, then stopping abruptly. He turned his head once, eyes fixed on a section of wall Graham had not examined closely. It was unremarkable at first glance, smooth clay reinforced with timber, identical to the rest, but the dog did not move away. He raised one paw and placed it against the surface, not scratching, not digging, simply touching. Graham's pulse slowed. He approached and studied the wall under the slanted light. There it was, a line too straight to be natural, a seam so carefully disguised it only revealed itself when the light hit at an angle. The clay here was smoother, more deliberate, packed not to conceal damage, but to seal access. "All right," Graham said quietly. "You found it." He worked patiently, using a small pry bar and a brush, peeling away decades of packed earth without forcing it. Whoever had sealed this section had not intended for it to disappear forever. They had intended for it to wait. When the panel finally loosened, it did not crumble. It opened. Behind it lay a narrow chamber barely wider than Graham's shoulders. The air inside was denser, cooler, untouched by the gentle circulation of the rest of the house. Valor leaned forward, sniffed once, then sat back on his haunches, posture alert but calm. Not alarmed, not curious, certain. Graham retrieved gloves and eased the contents out one by one. Bundles wrapped in oilcloth and canvas, darkened by age but intact. Documents. He laid them on the table near a narrow window where light fell cleanly. The first bundle revealed blueprints, yellowed but precise, cross-sections of the structure annotated with measurements and arrows, airflow channels, thermal mass zones, load paths. This was not improvisation. This was engineering. Beneath the plans lay a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked, the edges softened by time and handling. The handwriting inside was tight and disciplined, the script of someone trained to think in systems rather than stories. The name on the inside cover stopped Graham's breath for a moment. Dr. Everett Caney. The entries described an experimental project, an earth-sheltered structure designed to moderate heat, resist fire, and redistribute geological stress. The mountain had not been chosen for beauty. It had been chosen for pressure. The notes grew darker toward the end. A miscalculation during testing, subsurface instability, a collapse that trapped two men. One survived, one did not. The project was halted, officially deferred, unofficially abandoned. The final entry was brief. If this place endures, it will not be because we were right, but because the mountain allowed it. Graham closed the journal slowly. Valor rose and placed his head against Graham's knee, weight solid and grounding. "You felt it," Graham murmured. "Didn't you?" As he gathered the remaining documents, something slid free from the bottom of the stack. An envelope, newer than the rest, the paper not yellowed, only aged. A familiar handwriting marked the front. Lila. Graham froze. He had not spoken her name aloud since the day he received the letter from the State Heritage Office. Seeing her handwriting, slanted slightly, precise but warm, felt like stepping into a room he had sealed off to survive. He did not open it immediately. He sat instead, elbows on the table, staring at the envelope as if it might move. Lila had been careful, methodical. She never wrote casually. When he finally broke the seal, the paper inside held only a few lines. "Graham, if you're reading this, it means you listened, to Valor or to yourself, maybe both. This place isn't an inheritance, it's a responsibility. I didn't understand all of it when I started looking, but I understood enough to know it wasn't meant to stay buried. Whatever happens next, promise me you won't walk away without knowing why it was built. L." The weight that settled in Graham's chest was not grief. It was clarity. She had not sent him here to give him something. She had sent him here to finish something. The sound of boots on stone broke the silence. Graham looked up to see Cole Maddox standing in the entryway, hat in hand. The older ranger's face looked drawn, the lines around his eyes deeper than before, as if the mountain had aged him overnight. "You found it," Cole said, not a question. Graham nodded and slid the blueprints across the table. Cole studied them with a practiced eye, his fingers hovering just above the paper, careful not to touch without permission. "This explains a lot," Cole said quietly, "and complicates everything." Before Graham could respond, a distant mechanical hum rolled through the slope, low and steady. Valor's head snapped up, ears rigid. The vibration registered underfoot, subtle but unmistakable. Cole's jaw tightened. "They're back." They stepped outside together. Down the ridge, Redstone's equipment had returned. More trucks this time, heavier rigs, their movements efficient and purposeful. Cole watched them for a long moment. "They're establishing baseline data," he said, "trying to move before anyone can stop them." Graham looked back at the structure, then at the plans in his hands. He understood now what Lila had seen and what Caney had feared. Drill into the wrong pocket, and the mountain would not fail loudly. It would fail inward. Inside, the house remained calm, the air steady, the walls patient. Valor moved back to his chosen place along the inner wall and lay down, body relaxing in a way it had not during the survey incident. Graham folded the blueprints carefully and placed them back on the table. He did not say the decision aloud. He did not need to. Cole saw it in his posture, the way he squared his shoulders without bracing. "I won't walk away," Graham said finally. "Not now." Cole nodded once. "Then we do this right." As evening approached, the mountain held its breath again. The machines below continued their work, unaware of the system watching them from within. Graham sat beside Valor, one hand resting against the cool stone, and felt the truth settle fully at last. The structure had not been waiting for a savior. It had been waiting for someone willing to listen. The pressure arrived quietly, the way most consequential things did. It came not with sirens or shouted warnings, but in envelopes slid through mail slots, in clipped phone calls returned late in the afternoon, in language polished smooth enough to hide its edges. Graham Sutter felt it before he read it, a tightening in the room as if the air itself had been asked to choose sides. He stood at the kitchen table in Bozeman, the blueprints spread carefully beside Dr. Everett Kane's journal, Lila's letter tucked inside like a compass needle. Valor lay at his feet, head up, eyes tracking the subtle changes in Graham's breathing. Outside, summer heat pressed against the house, cicadas clicking in the cottonwoods with mechanical patience. The first notice was labeled Occupancy Review, printed on heavy paper, the phrasing neutral and dense. The second referenced safety reassessment with a deadline that assumed compliance rather than conversation. They wanted him gone. Not yet, not forcibly. They wanted him to choose it. Graham folded the papers once and set them aside. He had learned long ago that panic narrowed options. Attention widened them. That afternoon, Cole Maddox drove up without calling ahead. The ranger's truck crunched slowly up the dirt drive, its suspension complaining softly. Cole stepped out with more stiffness than usual, the heat settling into joints that had earned every ache. He removed his hat and wiped his brow, revealing thinning gray hair flattened by sweat. His eyes, pale blue and sharp, moved through the room with the practiced habit of someone trained to notice what didn't belong. "They're fast-tracking," Cole said after scanning the notices. "County's under pressure. Redstone's leaning hard." Graham nodded. "I figured." "You could still walk away," Cole added, not as advice but as acknowledgement. "No one would blame you." Valor rose and moved to the doorway, ears lifting as a distant sound carried through the afternoon. Engines. Graham watched the dog for a moment, then shook his head. "If I leave," he said, "they drill." Cole's jaw tightened. "And if you stay, they'll push harder." "Then we need daylight," Graham replied, "not noise." They drove back to the mountain as the sun dipped low, throwing long shadows across the slope. The Redstone crew had expanded operations, more equipment, more men, bright markers planted into soil that had never been asked permission to hold them. Graham approached the site on foot, Valor close at his side, posture angled toward the ground rather than the men. He found Caleb Turner near a rig, clipboard in hand, his confidence worn smooth by repetition. "You've been busy," Graham said. Caleb smiled politely, the expression practiced. "Standard escalation." "You're drilling into a fault pocket," Graham replied. Caleb's smile faltered just enough to be noticed. "We've run the data." "So did the engineers who built what's under this hill," Graham said evenly, "and one of them died for it." That gave Caleb pause, not enough to stop, but enough to listen. The warning came without ceremony. A sharp crack echoed through the trees like a rifle shot. The ground beneath Graham shifted, not violently, not enough to throw him, enough to kill him if he stood still. Valor lunged, teeth catching the back of Graham's jacket, yanking him sideways as the soil where he'd been standing collapsed inward. Rocks slid. Dirt gave way. Men shouted. Equipment shut down. Cole was there seconds later, gripping Graham's arm, hauling him back to solid ground. "That," Cole said sharply to the stunned crew, "is what I've been trying to tell you." The incident changed the tone, not the intent, but the pace. Work was suspended pending review. Engineers were called, reports were filed. Graham spent the next 48 hours doing what he did best. He documented. He overlaid Kane's diagrams with modern survey data, traced fault lines Cole remembered from decades of patrols, marked every place Valor had refused to step. The pattern emerged slowly, then unmistakably. Valor was not leading. He was reacting, to pressure, to vibration, to changes beneath the surface that instruments registered too late. "You're treating him like a sensor," Cole observed one evening as they worked side by side. "He is one," Graham replied without looking up. They submitted the findings through channels designed to resist urgency. Cole leveraged old contacts, quiet conversations, people who remembered winters that nearly took them. The structure became central to the argument, not as a residence, but as evidence, a proof of concept that predated modern sustainability rhetoric by decades. The county inspector arrived on the third morning. Her name was Marla Quince, mid-50s, compact and solidly built, iron-gray hair cut close to her head. Her face was shaped by years of telling people things they didn't want to hear, and her eyes missed very little. She walked the structure slowly, hands in her coat pockets, listening more than speaking. She pressed her palm to the packed clay walls, the same way Graham had days earlier, then crouched near a ventilation slit, feeling the current of air with a practiced patience. "This doesn't behave like a normal structure," Marla said finally. "No," Graham agreed. "It behaves like a system." Marla looked at Valor, who sat watching her with calm intensity. "And the dog?" "He listens," Graham said. Marla snorted softly. "Smartest thing in this room." The inspection lasted hours. By the end, Marla's skepticism had shifted, not to approval, but to caution of a different kind. "I'll file my report," she said as she prepared to leave. "It won't make everyone happy." "I don't need happy," Graham replied. Outside, the forest was quiet again, machines stilled, men uncertain. Cole stood beside Graham at the edge of the ridge, the valley spread out below them in hazy summer light. "You understand systems," Cole said. "You understand consequences." Graham kept his eyes on the slope. "I understand responsibility." That night, the house shifted, not violently, not enough to wake the world below, but enough for Graham to feel it in his bones. Valor rose instantly and pressed himself against the inner wall of the middle tier, ears flattening then lifting again, tracking something that moved through ground rather than air. The distant whine of machinery cut off abruptly. Silence followed. Graham placed his hand against the wall. The vibration was gone. Whatever pressure had been building had adjusted just enough to be felt, just enough to be dangerous if ignored. In the quiet that followed, Graham understood the shape of the space he occupied. He was not the owner. He was not the hero. He was the narrow space between ignorance and collapse. The house did not ask him to save it. It asked him to stay attentive. When dawn came, it did so gently, light sliding across the stone as if in acknowledgement. Valor returned to his place and lay down, body loosening, breath steady. Graham sat beside him, the journal open to Kane's final line, Lila's letter folded carefully beneath. He did not feel chosen. He felt allowed. And that, he knew, was enough to keep him standing where it mattered most. The decision arrived without ceremony, folded once, and slid through the narrow slot beside the door. Graham Sutter read it standing at the kitchen table, the paper light enough to feel almost apologetic in his hands. The language had changed. Where earlier notices had bristled with conditions and deadlines, this one spoke in careful restraint. Temporary suspension of extraction activity, pending permanent review. It was not a victory. It was a pause, the kind that asked whether someone would remain attentive long enough to earn permanence. Valor sat at Graham's side, posture loose, head tilted slightly as if listening for what came next. Outside, the heat had softened, the day clouded by a thin veil of smoke drifting from fires miles away. The mountain, for the first time in weeks, felt unhurried. They returned to the structure that afternoon with a different kind of company. A white state truck pulled up behind Graham's, and a woman stepped out who moved with the yashante, unself-conscious competence of someone used to uneven ground. Her name was Dr. Hannah Pike, an environmental engineer from the State University, early 40s, sun-browned skin, hair pulled into a practical braid that swung between her shoulders. She wore scuffed boots and carried a field notebook thick with tabs, her eyes bright with a curiosity sharpened by caution. She didn't reach for a handshake immediately. She looked first at the slope, the flagged areas now bare, the door that did not look like a door until you knew how to see it. "This is the one," she said, not asking. Graham nodded. "It listens better than most." Inside, Hannah moved slowly, touching nothing until she understood the space with her body. She felt the airflow with her hands, measured temperature changes with a small handheld device, crouched to study the angles where corridors bent. She asked few questions and took many notes. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, threaded with restrained, "Oh." "This isn't just passive cooling," she said. "It's load mediation. It's teaching the mountain where to send its anger." Valor watched her with the polite interest he reserved for people who paid attention without demanding it. When she knelt near the inner wall, he shifted closer, not protective, simply present. Hannah noticed and smiled, small and genuine. "He's reading micro changes," she said. "Better than our sensors in some conditions." "He's had practice," Graham replied. As the afternoon deepened, more visitors arrived, quietly, deliberately. June Hart drove up from Bozeman, her car dusted by the road, her glasses sliding down her nose as she stepped out with a folder hugged to her chest. She had traded her library cardigan for a light jacket and sturdy shoes, but her posture remained the same, attentive, respectful. Behind her came a county planner named Elias Rowe, tall and angular, with a neatly trimmed beard and a habit of pausing, mid-step to reassess. He had grown up in a mining family and carried the conflict in the lines around his mouth, belief in work, tempered by the memory of loss. They gathered inside the middle tier, where the air held steady despite the day's heat. Hannah explained what she saw. Elias asked careful questions about zoning categories and precedent. June produced archived documents that bridged the gap between history and policy. Graham listened, answering when necessary, watching how the room settled into a rhythm that felt, if not safe, then workable. The mountain made its case quietly. Late afternoon brought a test no one requested. Wind rose abruptly, shifting direction with the brittle snap of dry season weather. A plume of smoke thickened on the horizon, closer than before. Radios crackled. Cole Maddox's voice cut through the air as his truck skidded into the clearing, dust billowing. "Fire jumped the line," he said, breathless but controlled. "Evac routes compromised. We've got a handful of vehicles stuck on the spur." Graham did not hesitate. He did not look to Hannah or Elias for permission. He looked to Valor, who was already moving toward the door, posture intent. They guided the stranded drivers, 3 families and a single ranch hand, up the slope in measured groups. The heat outside was punishing, smoke stinging eyes and throats. Inside the structure, the air remained breathable, the temperature tolerable. People settled along the middle tier, sitting on the stone, pressing their backs to walls that felt improbably cool. Children cried once, then stopped. The ranch hand, a man in his 20s with sunburned cheeks and hands calloused raw, stared at the walls like they might vanish. "This place real?" he asked. Graham nodded. "It listens." As the fire pushed past the ridge and the wind shifted again, the structure did what it had always done. It held. Smoke thinned at the vents. Heat bled upward and away. Valor, moved among the group once, checking faces, then returned to his place by the inner wall, body relaxed but alert. By nightfall, the danger receded. The families left quietly, gratitude expressed in small, careful ways. No one took photos, no one asked for explanations. The mountain did not need spectacle. In the days that followed, the pause hardened into protection. Hannah's report carried weight, measured, precise, impossible to dismiss without admitting negligence. Elias shepherded a reclassification through the county, rare engineered structure, historical and technical significance. Extraction activity suspended. June organized the records, ensuring the story remained intact without becoming sensational. Redstone withdrew their equipment piece by piece. The spur road returned to its uneven silence. Flags disappeared. The mountain exhaled. Graham did not celebrate. He adjusted. He repaired what needed repair and left alone what worked. He placed the journal back in its chamber, this time leaving the panel unsealed, not as invitation, but acknowledgement. He added a simple sign near the path, burned into reclaimed wood. Sutter Ridge Shelter, open when it matters. June visited on weekends, bringing food and questions and a quiet companionship that asked nothing it could not wait for. Cole stopped by less often, his patrols lighter now, his shoulders easing, as if the land had released a fraction of its claim on him. Hannah returned once more with students who listened more than they spoke, learning how to stand without conquering. One evening, as summer leaned toward its gentler close, Graham sat on the stone with Valor at his side. The dog slept deeply, legs loose, breath slow. Graham watched the light move across the walls and felt something settle that he had not known how to name before. Not happiness, not closure, stability. He understood then what Lila had trusted him to learn. Some places did not want to be owned. They wanted to be attended. The miracle was not the structure, nor the mountain, nor the moment when danger had passed. The miracle was quieter. The courage to stay where listening mattered. Outside, the wind softened. Inside, the system held. Graham rested his hand against the wall, and for the first time since grief had taught him how thin the world could be, he felt no need to brace. The mountain had exhaled, and he had learned how to breathe with it. Sometimes the miracle is not loud. It doesn't arrive with thunder or instant rescue or a life suddenly made perfect. Sometimes the miracle is quieter. It is the moment God places us exactly where we are needed, not to escape the world, but to stand within it, not to erase our pain, but to give it meaning. God did not remove the mountain in front of him. Instead, he taught him how to stand on it without falling. Through patience, through attention, through the courage to stay when walking away would have been easier. And maybe that is how God often works in our own lives, through small responsibilities that slowly heal us, through relationships that arrive gently, through moments of stillness we almost ignore, but shouldn't. If you are watching this today carrying grief, exhaustion, or the feeling of being forgotten, remember this: you are not alone. God sees you. And even now, something quiet may be unfolding in your life. A second chance, a purpose, a miracle growing slowly in the dark. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope tonight. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, your country, your city, or simply what this story reminded you of. And if you believe no one should ever face fear alone, especially children and animals, subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories that heal, restore faith, and remind us we are not forgotten. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps. Wherever you are in the world, may peace find you tonight.